Welcome back to the InDEPth podcast. Today's guest is Mr. James E. Ford. He is an award winning educator and consultant on issues of equity and education. He was appointed by Governor Cooper to serve as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education, representing the Southwest region. He is the former program director at the Public School Forum of North Carolina, an education think tank and policy advocacy organization. Prior to this, he served as the 2014-15 North Carolina Teacher of the Year and the representative for 95,000 public school teachers throughout the state. For a full year, he traveled the state and county speaking before thousands of teachers, students, business leaders, and policymakers about the importance of education. He is a member of Alpha Phi Fraternity Incorporated. He's a husband and a father of four, two of which are twins. And me and him have that in common because I'm about to have a set of twins myself. And he was not the most encouraging about me having twins. He really scared me and basically told me that the first 5 years will be painful. And after that, the pain doesn't go away, but you learn how to deal with it. So I'm excited to have my brother James Ford on this podcast. He's somebody I look up to. I follow him on social media, and he's just an advocate for all things right. So I thank you for joining me today, brother Ford.
Appreciate you, brother Greg. It's all good, man. Sorry about that.
Well, look, let's. So I have a lot of stuff I want to get into with you, but can you just start out by telling us a little bit about how you came up and what led you to the point up until you becoming North Carolina State Teacher of the Year?
Yeah, sure. So although I live in North Carolina, I'm a native of the Midwest. I'm a native of Northern Illinois. And at the time I was coming up in the 1980s and 1990s, my school district, a city called Rockford, about 90 miles northwest of Chicago, um, you know, it embodied a whole lot of Midwestern racism. And it's the kind that's covert. It's not overt. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
it's disguised. And the school district was one that was violating federal laws and running a segregated school district. So by the time I started going to school was after like lawsuits, and I was getting bused from my neighborhood, which is southwest side of Rockford, to like the white schools to help integrate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, man, early on, I always tell people at the age of 5, I was already introduced to being called the word, nigga. And, you start to understand very quickly what that means. You start to know what it means to be treated differently by your peers and the adults who are overseeing your education. And you just become intimately familiar with racism. And I knew as a young person, I was like, I don't understand this. I need to figure out what this is and make it my life's work to dismantle it. Eventually, I had a better opportunity after switching schools, but that's what inspired, I think, the fire within me. And, I didn't go to school to be a teacher, man. I was a subpar student who barely made it out of high school, but I had some teachers who believed in me and who saw that I wasn't a knucklehead despite my behavior, that I was really just not interested. School didn't speak to my interests. And it was those people who, led me to always want to sort of give back and direct my work toward the youth. So after I came out of school, I had a job, doing nonprofit work, eventually started working directly with youth, and went back to school to get my master's in '09 to be a teacher because I enjoyed that so much. And man, taught 1 year back home in Rockford, moved to Charlotte, taught 5 years there, and became North Carolina Teacher of the Year in 5 years, and just kind of found a way to increase my platform and talk about the things, as I mentioned, I experienced, because I know that kids like mine that I taught as well as myself as a child, many of those things haven't changed. So that's what gives me the fire to do this equity work, man. It's born out of personal experience.
Did you're a history teacher?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And what inspired you to want to go into that particular direction?
I come from a very socially conscious family. Both my mother and my father were they weren't formally educated at a high level. I mean, they went back and got their college degrees, but when I was growing up, they weren't, credentialed, but they were always learning. And my dad was the historian of the household. Like he was a history buff. He always read books from the library, recorded videos from the History Channel, National Geographic. So he always was teaching us about like who we are as people of African descent, history of Africa prior to colonialism and imperialism. Um, and so that historical orientation was always one that was in my household. So I just think I picked that up from him. And then my mother was like an expert communicator, man. So I do a lot of writing and speaking. That was more her bag, man. She just believed in like being an effective communicator. And so teaching gave me the best of both worlds. It allowed me to be able to get up in front of young people and, and present things in a compelling way. but also still anchored in that historical understanding of the world, and how everything happening now is just a manifestation of things from the past.
Okay, so I talked to you about the things I kind of want to cover in this session, but what I didn't tell you was one of my friends from back home. I'm from Clarksville, Tennessee. One of my friends named Dante. He posted something and it said, "Racism will forever confuse me because what did we actually do for them to hate us this much?" And with everything that's going on in the country today, and me listening to your PD that you held here in Louisville, it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. So I really want this podcast to be for people that, I mean, even people like myself. I didn't learn true history. A lot of stuff was left out. I didn't learn true history, and everything that I learned, it's an everyday journey for me. I'm still trying to learn. And you open my eyes to a lot of things, and I've never even thought about the origin of the idea of race. And that's something that you touched on in your PD. So can you just talk to us about like the idea of race? Where does race even come from?
Yeah, and first let me answer your brother Dante's question, and the answer is nothing. We didn't do anything to deserve this. Racism, as we know it, is based upon this idea of race that it has no scientific merit. It's completely fabricated, and the concept itself is only about 600 years old. It was created by European philosophers, lawyers, and scientists, but again, no science was involved. It was strictly based on your phenotype, and so we're talking about your hair texture, your skin tone, your nose width, things of that nature, in a way of categorizing people, but not just categorizing people, but ranking them. And so as soon as race is introduced as an idea, concurrently with that is this idea of a hierarchy. Who's on top, who's on bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And those very European philosophers who created it, Blumenbach and Buffon, Meuniers, and some Enlightenment philosophers as well, they always gave the top position to Europeans or to white people. And they always ascribed the bottom position to people of African descent because they're flip sides of the same coin. They're the yin and the yang, right? If you're going to have white, then the opposite of white has to be black, right? And that's kind of how it's cast. You could shuffle the order of folks in between, but that's the basic framework right there. And that whole idea, that concept, man, it got popularized, and it was used to inspire colonialism. So now people can go into other people's lands or other people's territories and take them over and dispossess these people and not feel bad about it because we've made up this idea of race and said to ourselves that we're inherently better than these people. And so we ought not feel bad about the way that we mistreat them or taking their lands or taking their possessions. And so when you think about all the things that have given European powers their wealth, that have, made the world what it is, even how we sit here right now on Native American land, that's inspired by this idea of race, man. And, those people, black and brown people, we haven't done anything that should justify that at all. It's all been used as an excuse primarily for political and economic power grabbing. And we still see the legacy of that today, man. It really all dates back to that.
Now, we talk about the legacy of that today. Of course, we're in the United States, and there's a lot of talk about racism in the United States. Now, can you talk about how racism is just embedded in the creation of our country, like from the beginning? How was racism? I know the obvious stuff, with slavery, but can you break it down a little bit and talk about how race was embedded in the whole creation of our entire country?
Yeah, so I think you start with Christopher Columbus, right? I mean, so not just the United States, but in the Americas, quote unquote. When he comes here and you look at his journals and his diaries, he talks about how he can see that the native people they're handsome, they're good looking, they're dark skinned, they're kind and humble and giving, and then he pivots and says we can make them do whatever we want.
Wow.
And so instantly he's leveraging this difference as an idea for domination. But you want to talk about the formation of the United States of America, all of the quote unquote founding fathers of this nation were inspired by the Enlightenment philosophers, right? As I mentioned before, the Voltaires, the Rousseaus, and these are people who said like all men are created equal, but even they had racist ideas. Voltaire said that, Africans didn't even descend from human beings. They descended from monkeys. And so you see that same train of thought in the belief systems of Thomas Jefferson, who, is a great American thinker, but also was racist himself, said he doesn't know whether, Africans are human beings or whether they evolved from monkeys or whatever. These are the people who created, you know, wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? Who then created the United States Constitution. And so their thinking is influenced by, you know, an entirely racist legacy. And so it makes sense then that in our nation's founding document that, well, you know, black folks are considered not even full humans, right? That it, you know, that in that document, race, although not explicit, is used as a justification to subjugate people and treat them as less than human. So then it's no small wonder then, man, when you look at, you know, 200 and almost 50 years later, that, you know, we're still fighting for the humanity of black people, that, you know, a war breaks out that almost destroys a young nation, and it's really over not just slavery, it's the willingness to recognize us as human. And some people just didn't want to do that, and they was willing to scrap over that when you think about it. And so here we are now, and we're taking to the streets fighting for the same exact thing, but it's in the ground, man. It's just part of our legacy.
Now, and it's crazy that you talk about the people that came up with the idea of race. Of course, they put themselves at the top of the hierarchy. So that's just, you know, of course, that's the way that would go. Now, can you talk about the racial wealth gap in the United States? A lot of people talk about, you know, you'll have white people that say, yes, I understand slavery was bad. It was hard, but that was so long ago. You have to get over it. And you have this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, working hard. You can get what I have. This is America. Everybody has the opportunity to gain wealth. Can you talk about why that may be flawed thinking and the difference that that literally people had by hundreds of years, how that's still seen today, and how it's you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a good question too. Let me break it down for you. So one day my father said to me, "Hey, you know, son, I was born 75 years after slavery." And I started laughing. And I was like, "Dad, stop playing. Like, that don't make no sense." And then I looked and I thought, and at the time he said this, he was 75. And I did the math. I said, whoa, actually, that's true, right? Like my father was born 75 years after the end of slavery. And so the idea that this was eons ago is false, man. That's one I want to start with. Two is you have to understand like the denial of wealth and opportunity. If you're going to say that America is a meritocracy and it's a place of opportunity and freedom, that for 200 some years, then you deny, at least on paper, people the opportunity to even benefit from their own labor. You know what I'm saying? And all this time while it's happening, you have immigrants from all over Europe that are coming, and for them, it is sort of a oasis or a promised land. But for us, we've been denied that for generations. And when you free us, you don't give us any sort of wealth to stand on. You usher us into a system of debt slavery known as sharecropping, which my grandparents did. And so, like Frederick Douglass said, freedom was freedom to hunger, freedom to struggle, was freedom without any undergirding. You deal with another 100 years of a whites-only society, also known as Jim Crow, right? Where you're denying us of opportunities, right? You're even in the North, you're denying us of the opportunity to accrue wealth through home ownership. So $120 billion are given to white families from the 1930s to the 1960s to be able to buy homes and build up home equity, and only 2% of that goes to non-white people. So for 3 decades after that, you're denying us of the opportunity to even get, the wealth that white folk, many of them enjoy now, whether they're recent immigrants or not. And so from the perspective of black folks, we're like, man, this stuff was just yesterday, and the impacts of it are intergenerational. It ain't like, because our ancestors are dead that we don't still deal with the disadvantage, and that white people aren't still advantaged because of the things that their ancestors were able to benefit from. And so that's just not a realistic portrayal. But I mean, you can go down the line with the Social Security Act. When that was signed, the two professions that denied Social Security insurance were domestic workers and agricultural workers. We know who did those jobs. The GI Bill, allowing folks to go to school, except for those black schools. So I mean, all these things are things that people tell us build wealth, and we've been denied those things generation after generation. So you can't just tear stuff out the pages of history and act like it didn't happen. It impacts our present reality.
Yeah, and I blame the public school system because I literally learned about the difference in the GI Bill last year on my own research. And every time we do a racial wealth gap simulation with audiences, most of the time we do this with a predominantly white audience. Every time they learn about the fact that black soldiers fought next to white soldiers, but when they came home were denied loans to be able to buy homes, they're always like, "Wow, I had no idea about that," and it's just so crazy. And I'm gonna ask you this, and I know this is maybe hard because of who you are. If you take away the fact that you're a black man, if you just look at being a history teacher, how can how can it be defended that a history teacher can literally like it just ignore black history and ignore the injustices that black people have? Because honestly, you know, when people say systemic racism is a myth, that's something the left wing liberals made up to
Yeah.
it's just a crutch for them. Like literally, I really, through everything that's going on in the world today, I really almost I can understand now why people don't believe us. You know what I'm saying? So like if you were defending history teachers, how can they really teach history without teaching the full history?
You know what, man? I'll send you a piece that I wrote a couple years ago for the Education Post, and I forget the exact title, but essentially what I say is that, like, you know, man, we have an obligation as history teachers to address white supremacy, and we have to name it that. And I talk about how for years as a world history teacher, I tried not to name it, man. I tried because, you know, it's controversial and you can get in trouble, whatever. But it has got to the point where the students were asking such good questions, and historically, the evidence is there. You just can't deny it. The only reason why you wouldn't teach these things is to preserve an idea of white supremacy, man. You know, an idea that white folk are inherently and European descendants are inherently better, smarter, craftier, more ingenious than, you know, than their black and counterparts of color. And the way you do that is you truncate everybody else's history. You got to cut everybody else's history down by miles because you got to lower them to make yourself feel higher. And so you can't talk about the fighting, the Harlem Hellfighters, man. You know what I'm saying? The fighting 364. You can't talk about the Red Tails, right? You can't talk about the Buffalo Soldiers. You can't talk about all the inventors. You can't talk about the ways that we've been robbed and all the lynchings and because it would disrupt that idea of white supremacy. And so, you know, I don't blame a lot of those people. You know, like,
Right.
if I've been lied to my whole life, and if I've been told America's a place where you pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and you get back what you put in, and if I look around, and if that's what I accept as truth, and I see black people and Latino people and Native Americans not make, I'm gonna say, well, dang, what's wrong with them? Right? Something must be wrong with them. And so
Right.
that's only facilitated through miseducation, bro. And we talk about the miseducation of the Negro a lot because of the book by Carter G. Woodson. But I
Mhm.
also think we need to talk about the miseducation of white people in America because we have deliberately denied a lot of white people of the truth. And it has by default made them racist because, again, you're going to look at the situation and say, what's wrong with these people? And I totally understand that because of how traditional education has gone.
Okay, so this is what we're gonna talk about next. Is kind of a topic that a lot of people like to stay away from. But can you talk about how racism, how religion has been used to perpetuate racism? Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, so in many ways, and a lot of folk don't want to hear this, and Christianity is not exclusive because there was a Muslim Arab slave trade as well. But in the Western world, Christianity has been used as a justification primarily through the misinterpretation of the curse of Ham, right? So this idea that that Noah's sons, right? Um, him getting or rather, you know, um, Jacob's sons, rather, right? Getting drunk and seeing him and cursing Ham and his descendants, and as a result of that, um, the idea that black people come from Ham, they descend from Ham, specifically Canaan, that they're doomed to be servants to their brothers. That was used to say, well, you can always do this. You can apply this to any group of people and say, well, those are the descendants of Ham. Those are the descendants of Canaan. That's why they're in positions of servitude. And listen, and people don't want to hear this thing, but one time where folks' skin gets cursed in the Bible at all, and it doesn't turn black, it turns white, right? Where Moses sticks his hand in his bosom, pulls it out, and it's leprous as snow. But again, that's just a religious justification for deliberately disenfranchising certain folks. But in most Christian theologies, that was the idea that inspired why segregation, why racism, why slavery was a good idea. In the New Testament, the writings of Paul, Paul talking about slaves be obedient to your masters. Those were the sort of scriptures that were held up, that were used as a tool of control for enslaved populations. So not only are you coming into territories inspired by the idea of spreading the gospel, right? God, gold, and glory. So you come into the Western hemisphere and you say, it's okay, we're going to take up these lands of these Native American peoples because we're introducing them to Christianity. And even if we kill them, at least we're saving their soul. That was an inspiration. But two is when you enslave people, you're using scripture as a justification as to why they should serve you. And so, I mean, listen, I'm a believer, I'm a Christian, I'm clergy on top of all of these things, right? But when it comes to how scriptures have been twisted and how religion has been used as a tool of empire, it can't be denied, man, that has been a go-to move. That's been the Jordan fadeaway, the Iverson crossover of like, of disenfranchising people. And so you have to be wary of the ways that religion can unfortunately be used for very nefarious purposes.
And the crazy thing is that when people know what you just said without the proper context of knowing that they're just bastardizing the word of God, that it's literally turned people away from Christianity because of the way some people abused it. So I think it's important. I know this is a JCPS podcast, but I'm going to ask this question. What do you think the church's responsibility is when they see the things that are going on with George Floyd and all the injustices in the world now? What do you think the church can do to help with race relations?
So all faith communities, I think, no matter what religious tradition you follow, all of them are basically golden rule based faith traditions that are, predicated on the idea of treating others the way you want to be treated. Specifically, questions about Christianity, I'd say, monitor the prophets and, the luminaries and, the central figure of that faith tradition and see what they said about injustice. They come from particularly the Judeo-Christian tradition, whether you're talking about Old Testament prophets of Jeremiah, Isaiah, right? These are folks who called nations to account, even their own nations, their own people groups at times when they were passing unjust laws or when they were operating in ways that were unfair or not doing right by the alien and the foreigner, not doing right by the poor person, the widow, the fatherless, the sick and shut out person. The founding figure of Christianity. You look at how much time he spends talking about class conflict, if you will, and talking about rich people and the difficulty of rich people getting into heaven and what a rich person should do in order to obtain and reach the kingdom of God. This is just not the traditional popular versions of Christianity that we hear. But if adherents to that faith tradition were to follow the tenets of that faith, I think that they'll figure out what they need to do. And that is just to follow the footsteps of the folks who came before them. You're supposed to be beacons of light, in dark times, and to do the things that all of those figures, be they Moses, right, be they David, be they Jesus, that they said to do in moments like that. And so I don't want to tell folks what to do other than like research your own faith.
Right, got you. All right, can you talk about how schools have perpetuated racism?
Oh man,
and we've talked about that a little bit, but I definitely want you to talk about gifted and talented in particular.
Yeah, so so one thing I should state from the outset is, in addition to being a consultant, I also run an organization called the Center for Racial Equity in Education, or CREED. And one of the things we do is research, and we did exhaustive research of like how racism shows up in North Carolina public schools. And we found it shows up in a myriad of ways, man. It's not just one. It's a whole system, everything from composition of teachers of color or lack thereof, to who gets access to the veteran teachers versus the novice teachers, to suspensions, to enrollment in classes, to who gets identified for EC, to, just go on down the line. And gifted and talented is one of those areas. Lots of scholars who deserve a shout out, like Donna Ford, like Joy Lawson Davis, who've done a lot of work around this. But what we see is that students of color are underrepresented in gifted and talented. And it's not because they're not gifted and talented. It's because they're under-identified because of our ideas of what makes one gifted and talented, how intelligence or aptitude shows up in certain populations. And when you don't understand the cultural backgrounds of folks, you might misinterpret certain things, right? I mean, I don't know about you, growing up in, Tennessee. But man, when I was growing up, man, there were wildly talented dudes, right? Dope dealers and, other folks who, man, they knew they were some of the smartest kids in the class. We could see it, but, for whatever reason, they didn't manifest that in the traditional ways. So those are the kids who get left behind and slip through the cracks. Or English language learners who maybe English is not the native language spoken, but they're gifted and they're talented. And kids of color, they get left behind, man. They don't get identified because of the systems we have that are set up for how we identify kids. And then, like I said, our paradigms of what makes one intelligent is rooted in a white supremacist ideology. It's normed after middle class white kids, and that's just not how everybody learns and not how everybody manifests their talent. So, like I said, that's one sliver of the ways that racism and racial inequity persists through our education. But it's definitely an area that I bet, without even looking at y'all data out there, JCPS, I bet it's one y'all see showing up in your school system too.
For sure. And I got two things to say to that. One, I wasn't gifted and talented. I got in after the second grade. But the thing is, my teacher that recommended me for it, she said that I was always talking in class. And she chose to look at that as she wanted me to get tested for gifted and talented because she thought I was bored in class. So she didn't look at it as a behavior issue. She looked at it as maybe he's not being challenged enough. And I think that's one real example of how teachers can choose to how they view certain behaviors. Another thing, I was listening to a podcast on my way to Tennessee, and Shaka Senghor, who's the author of Righting My Wrongs, he served a 19-year prison sentence for murder, but then now afterwards he got out, he got multiple degrees, and now he's a renowned author and all that kind of stuff. But he talked about how when he was in prison, they could do tattoos, and they would use cassette player, batteries, and ink pens, and they could put together something to do tattoos, and how they could basically create a phone line in prison to be able to communicate with each other. And he said he got out and he went to MIT, and he gave them some of the same challenges that he wanted them to try to create. And one of the things was he wanted them to create a lighter out of wire and two batteries. And the people that he went to school, that he went to MIT with, they couldn't do it, and they actually end up the power ended up going out. But he talked about how people view talents in different ways. In a lot of society, black and brown people are thrown away for their mistakes, and they're not seen as redeemable. When a lot of times they're geniuses, but they just don't have the same opportunities as some other people. So that's good stuff that you just said. Listening to one of your podcasts, you talked to a guy, and you said, and y'all talked about why it's important to know your students from a historical context. Can you talk about why that's important for teachers because you have teachers say, I don't see race, I don't see color. Why is it important to see your students for who they are?
Yeah, man, that's an excellent question, because your students they didn't just materialize out of thin air, right? The stork didn't drop them off, right? They come from people. They come from a community, and a community with history, and a community with stories. And so you think they're going to show up in your school and you're just going to not see race, which is a well-intentioned, the one is it's a lie, and it's a well-intentioned way of saying, like, I don't deal with all that. And truthfully, it's work avoidance, man. It's work avoidance, because it requires you having to study up, having to be a student and learn about who your students are. Because the way that they show up to you, they got particular histories. Like, you got Native students, they got a history in all likelihood with the education system, and schools have been used as a tool of empire, as a tool of subjugation and a forced assimilation and tearing families apart. You mean to tell me you're not gonna look at that context at all? You got black students. Man, it was illegal in this country for for African Americans to even be taught how to read, man. And then you're running separate school systems where you're underfunding them, and and school ain't necessarily a place, it may or may not be, depending on their experience, of wonderment, and we've been mistreated a lot in these school contexts. So you're just not going to deal with that at all? Or, so like, it is fundamentally principally important for you to recognize the full humanity of your students and to learn that, because otherwise what you're telling them is only certain portions of you are allowed in my classroom. Bring your brain in, but leave your body and your soul at the door. And you can't do that, man, and not be an effective teacher, because all instruction is culturally responsive. The question is, what cultures are you responding to?
Wow.
Right.
Wow. Okay, can you talk about there's about 85% of the teachers in America are white females. Can you talk about why there's a lack of black educators? Why do you believe?
Yeah, well, so again, here goes the history piece again. You know, there's a history behind that. It wasn't always that way. And even though we were prevented from learning in a formal environment as African Americans, you know, those separate and unequal, quote unquote, schools that we had, I mean, there were a lot of black teachers who were getting down in those environments, those shotgun sort of house, one building, several grades, climates. And, you know, that was one of the few professions we were able to go into, was teaching and preaching. All the HBCUs, like for the most part, that's what they were pumping out in the early years. And so you have all these black educators, all these black schools, and then suddenly we don't got no black teachers. Well, what happened? Well, again, Linda Tillman's work, she's demonstrated that, man, they laid off a lot of black teachers as a result of integration, because on the one hand, you're fighting for equity, and that's what is the impetus for desegregating schools, because we know this black segregated schools are being treated inferiorly, but we didn't integrate properly. We just desegregated. We mixed up the bodies and the colors of the bodies in the schools to a degree, but then we laid off black teachers because we didn't want black teachers teaching white kids, because that again, that would disrupt the racial hierarchy. You can't have black people in positions of authority over white kids. So thousands of black teachers and black principals were laid off, man, as a result of desegregation. And so now we end up with a diversity gap, you know, 50 to 60 years later, and we ask ourselves, how did this happen? Well, you created the circumstance to create that, and now we find ourselves trying to, you know, welcome brothers and sisters back into the profession and having kids that are taught by a majority black or majority white workforce, and even that impacts their aptitude and ability and identification for gifted, etc. So all these things work together, man.
Okay, yeah, a few more questions for you that can be kind of rapid fire, but of course, I think you probably felt this too. A lot of my white friends and they've contacted me through all of this and said, "How can I help? What can I do?" So, if you were responding to those text messages or those phone calls, what would you say?
I've been getting them too, man. And what I tell them is, one is, you know, I appreciate the gesture, you know, because our community is under attack right now. It's been under attack. But two, man, disrupt, man. Like, break decorum. Hashtag break decorum. Man, in your own personal circles, man, find ways to bring up the issue. You know what I mean? Like, don't let your white friends and white family get away with in your little staff meetings and stuff, not talking about what's happening right now. Break the decorum, man. Force the issue so they can discuss it. And two, do the self work, man. You know, do your own learning, man. Start on your own learning journey so that you can understand the issues, what's going on right now, but find a way to make something happen. No more being quiet.
What recommended readings or podcast subscriptions would you say to, whether it be white or black people that want to learn, go on their own journey of learning how to be conscious, how to be, you know, understand what I'm saying? What are some podcast subscriptions or recommended readings you would recommend?
Well, I'm gonna plug our podcast, the On the Margins podcast by Creed, available on all the major outlets. Also, Code Switch is an amazing NPR podcast that talks about race issues. Great episodes there. As far as readings, Dr. Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist is great. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility is a great place to start. And maybe A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn are good books that I think begin that process.
Okay. And what are your response to people who believe in the movement but not in the method? Because that's another thing that I've been getting is, I understand that people are upset, but why are they doing blank? So what is your response to that?
First things first, read Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And, you know, he talks about people who subscribe to that. And then two, you know, there ain't no right method, right? When you're Kaepernick and you kneel peacefully, that people got a problem with that. When folks start tearing up property, folks got a problem with that. So I submit that there is no right method. You just have to understand why people are doing what they're doing.
And you know, Ben Carson came out and said he believes that Kaepernick and the football players, they would have America would have accepted their peaceful protest if they had come out and said that they love America, because they he thinks that that's the only thing that people don't believe is when they kneel before the flag. They didn't. They People thought that they didn't love America. Well, then of course, if you look up the quotes, there's a quote from Colin Kaepernick verbatim. He said, "I love America. I just want it to become a better place." So, like you said, there's really no right method. And like you talked about, Dr. King, no matter what's ever done, it's never the right way to do it. What I think the right way in most people's eyes is you protest. That's good. You have a great cause. You protest, but do it on your side of town. Don't do
Mhm.
it in the street, because I don't want you messing up traffic. Do it in the park that I don't never go to, because nobody wants to be inconvenienced by protests. And I think that's what people have to understand. That's the point of the protest, is to inconvenience somebody and to disrupt, like you talked about. And last but not least, one of my other friends said that he believes that we're in a civil rights movement right now. Like, what do you believe that this moment in history is gonna I guess, going to produce? You know, some people will say that they're hopeful, they're doubtful, because they've seen this before and things haven't changed. But to me, you know, I'm 31, but this is the first time in my lifetime that I felt the way I feel now, and this is the first time in my lifetime that I've had white people to reach out to me and say, "Hey, I want to help." You know, when I went to a protest, I saw a lot of white people there, and of course, it could just be the gesture of coming to the protest, and this could all go away in 3 weeks. But what is your opinion on this moment that we're in right now? What do you think is going to be produced from this?
I think that this is a human rights issue. We've evolved where racism and white supremacy, one, is a global issue. It's not confined to the United States. It's a global issue, and it's now being recognized as a human rights issue. The United Nations is seeing it that way as well. I'm hopeful, man. I wasn't a week and a half ago, but seeing these people, these diverse bodies of people in mass, as a history teacher, I gotta tell you, it's unprecedented. Protests in all 50 states, rural communities, all over the globe, in London, Paris, New Zealand, Dublin. It's unreal what's happening right now, man. We got to galvanize this and finally rid the country and the world of the disease and the cancer of white supremacy. We won't have a nation. We won't have a planet unless we defeat that ideology, man. So I remain hopeful that this is our moment right now. And so, as long as I'm here, I'm 39, bro, and I ain't never been here before. So can't nobody tell me it can't be done. You know what
Right,
I'm saying? I'm gonna
right.
use this movement to change it.
All right. Can you tell everybody how they can follow you if they want to keep up with you?
Absolutely. I can be followed on Twitter. My handle is at JE NCTOY. I'm found on Instagram at the same handle. And if you want to reach me on my professional vocation, you can find me at creed-nc.org. Creed, CREED-nc.org. And just hit info. I can be contacted that way as well. Or jameseford.net. Either one of those is fine.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me today, man. You were one of my favorite people to follow on social media. You are, you know, you're unapologetic, and you believe in what's right, you know. And I think you talk about the human rights issue. Genuinely, I believe that the people that say, yeah, George Floyd was killed, but you know, Candace Owens included, I believe those people don't see black people as humans, you know. And I don't believe in the, you know, bringing up anybody's criminal past, or because the thing about our country, you're supposed to always get your day in court. So if somebody is suspected of a crime, then they should be able to get their day in court. And we've seen with a lot of people that don't have the same skin color as me and you do, we've seen them go to court and get off. I mean, for things like rape, mass shootings, and they get, you know, it seems like even the media portrays one side as having a mental health disorder and the other side is just bad or
Yep.
criminality. So I think that we have to all check our biases, black people included, not always assume that somebody that we're wrong, you know, but white and black people, we just have a lot of work to do. And I think that this is a critical time in history, and we have to make sure that our kids view people as everybody is human. And then I
That's right.
think we can really and genuinely change the future. So I thank you for joining me today, man. And I really appreciate you and everything you do.
Appreciate you, Fred. Thanks for having me.